Good morning, colleagues. This is the first meeting after the summer break. It's the appointed time and we've already formed a quorum, so let's call the meeting to order. First of all, the main purpose of the meeting is to review the Hotel and Guesthouse Accommodation Ordinance and also to meet with deputations and individuals. First of all, let's ask the Secretary to invite the deputations to join us. Indeed, the Secretariat has already prepared a background paper for members, paper number CB bracket 2, 2252 bracket 01. And a total of 19 deputations or individuals have indicated that they'd like to come and share their views with us. On top of that, the Secretariat has also received 4 submissions from organizations or individuals who will not be attending the meeting, and the Secretariat has already circulated all the submissions to the members of the panel as well as the administration. A welcome to all the deputations for coming to the meeting. Before we start, I'd like to remind all members that we do have this interpretation device, so you can put on the earpiece, and channel 0 is the floor, channel 1 is Cantonese, channel 2 is English, and channel 3 is Putonghua. When you speak, please remember to clip on the microphone, or else your remarks will not be input into the system. And also, please don't speak in mixed code in order to facilitate the interpreter's work. And your remarks will not be covered by the Electoral Powers and Privileges Ordinance, and therefore you will have to be responsible for your own remarks. And by way of a reminder to all the deputations and individuals, as well as those in the public gallery, that you are expected to comply with certain rules and regulations of this council, and the relevant rules and regulations have been tabled before you in this room and in the public gallery. And basically, you've already given your written submissions, and you will only be given 3 minutes, and when the time is up, there will be a bell to remind you that you have to stop. And for those who haven't yet submitted their written submissions, please do so as soon as practically possible. So without further ado, I'll invite the first deputation, Mr. Leung Tai Wai, founder chairman of the Hong Kong Guesthouses Association. Yes, my name is Leung Tai Wai. I'm representing thousands of guest houses, and I'm here to speak to members of this council and also members of the public. First of all, I have to tell the truth, and second, I hope that you seek justice on our behalf. The reason why I'm here, that's because with regard to the fire that broke out, many people had blamed it on us. In fact, I'd like to tell you this. That is, we have this newspaper which tells the truth. The fire was not caused by our guest house. We are from the Continental Mansion, and that's because of the OC of the Continental Mansion, which was not properly run, and as a result, all the stakeholders, residents, tenants, and also our guest house were affected by that fire. In other words, the fire broke out from outside, not from the guest house. We were not the cause of the fire, and I'm sure that lady told the public and also the administration she misled everybody, thinking that the fire was caused by us, and therefore I have to tell the truth today so that you know exactly what happened. This was reported in this daily newspaper, and I hope that officials and members of this council will from now on not be putting the blame on us, so that you would not be targeting us. Please do not target the hotel and guest house industry, because it's not fair is not just. This is point number one. And number two, what I like to say is that over the years, when we try to apply for a license, we are just members of the public, we are just small operators, and we are law-abiding, and we always follow the guidelines in submitting our applications. And they said that only guest houses in residential buildings will be granted a license, and if you try to move the goalpost, saying that we are not supposed to operate in residential buildings, then that would be unconstitutional, that's not fair, and that's not just. I hope that officials, you're supposed to serve the community. You should be serving the community by taking good care of us. And then for members of this council, whether or not you're district councillors or electoral members, you will have to make sure that justice is served and stop targeting us from now on. And also, please make sure that members of the public and the media would understand that you should help us, because we are small operators. We are also a member of the community. We should actually be helped. And according to what you said, apparently you have the view that because of this suspected fire that was caused by us, if you try to target us, that's not fair. Because we had this news article saying that in North Point, with regard to the hotel in North Point that had a fire, and it took them 3 hours to put out the fire, and you should be regulating the hotel industry, not the guest house industry. So please make sure that you know the truth. First of all, I'd like to introduce government officials who are here. We have Mr. Franco Kwok, Assistant Director from the HAD, and also Mr. Au Wing Hong, Chief Officer, Licensing Authority of the Home Affairs Department. Second speaker from the Mirador Mansion Guest House Association, Mr. Lo Kai Yiu. Thank you. I'd like to say a few words on the provisional license, because according to the 30 association, they said that some 1/3 of all the guest houses have not been licensed. The reason why that's been the case, that's because, well, when you try to apply for a license, is a very cumbersome process. Very often, it took us more than 2 years before we can get a license. That's why, with the provisional license in place, we hope that something can be done about it. And also, the FSO would allow us to get a license very expeditiously, but then other rules and regulations are very cumbersome. That's why a provisional license is really very important to us. And then for those who operate without a license, we hope that they can be given the assurance that they will be able to run their business properly, instead of taking 2 years for a license to be granted, because we are also going to have Class 1 and Class 2 license. It's really very difficult for us to get a license. So I've already set up my arguments in my written submission, and therefore I don't propose to spend too much time on that. Please refer to my written submission. And we have started to discuss the issue of a temporary license, because the FSO is very strict. So is it possible for you to put in place a mechanism whereby a provisional license can be granted as soon as we pass all the fire regulations? Yes, I'm just a member of the public, but then I know that with regard to the hotel industry accommodation ordinance, well, if it's to be amended, then many guest houses will no longer be able to operate. Does that mean that all visitors coming to Hong Kong will have to stay in luxury and expensive hotel if they are not able to find a guest house? And also for the licensed guest house within the same building, well, I think the environment will become actually better, because they will have to comply with the fire safety rules and regulations, and also for the corridors and back lanes and so on. They are not supposed to have any garbage accumulated there. In fact, there will be many people inspecting the premises. So I think that would actually improve the environment, because for people smoking and for people from different backgrounds coming into the building to patronize the pubs and bars, I think that would be even worse. So very often I would be waking up in the middle of the night saying that people have been smoking in a building, when they are not supposed to do so when they are staying indoors. So I hope that we would not be closing down all the guest houses. Are we asking that all visitors coming to Hong Kong will have to pay $1,000, $2,000 a night to stay in expensive hotels? That's all I'd like to say. Next, Mr. Louis. Well, before 1997, from the British Hong Kong colonial government to the SL government, all right, even if you apply for a business certificate, you can run a business. You can open a sportswear shop, and you can also do all sorts of business as soon as you get a business registration. But then, how come we are not able to run a guest house business? Because when we apply for a license before, we've been told that guest house could only be open in residential buildings because you're not allowed to run a guest house in a commercial building. The administration must not change its mind overnight. You should be consistent in your policy. And as Mr. Law just said, for people running guest house businesses, how many fires can be attributed to guest house operations? I don't think there have been many.
Personally, I think that exemption should be granted to licensed guest houses. If you take a cross-the-board approach, then the operators of licensed guest houses will be affected. If you have a license, well, you have to spend, say, over $100,000 to get to comply with all the regulations. So I think the government should take care of that. Well, the government would be looking at whether all the regulations are complied with before granting a license to an operator. Next one, Mr. Zheng Man-Lin. If the government has to amend the ordinance, it should target the new applicants and not the renewal of licenses. The old ordinance should be used when renewal applications are made, because the license operators are spending sums of money to get the license. If you don't allow them to renew the license, they will suffer a great loss. That's all I want to say. Next one, Ms. Tai Lena from Ashan Hostel. I speak on behalf of Ashan Hostel. We started operating in 1984, and then the ordinance was drawn up in 1991, and we complied with all the regulations before getting a license. Many friends talked about the possible losses because of the amendment. I'm not going to dwell on that. I want to talk about economic development. Since 2003, when the individual visit scheme was implemented, the number of tourists has been ever rising and posing a great demand for hotel rooms and guest house rooms. Since 2003 up to 2013, the occupancy rate is over 80%, both for hotels and guest houses. So if the government takes a cross-the-board approach and imposing additional requirements on guest houses, some 10,000 guest rooms will be lost, I believe. Now, the government is promoting tourism in Hong Kong, and we don't have budget accommodation for tourists. Will tourists come to Hong Kong? Perhaps they would turn to Taiwan or Korea. In fact, Taiwan and Korea have a lot of homestay lodgings, and if the Hong Kong government tries to eradicate the guest houses, then the tourism will be affected, and retail industry will be adversely affected too. So I think exemption should be granted to licensed guest houses, and only regulations should be imposed on new license applicants. I agree that we should enhance the licensing standards, but I think we should target the unlicensed guest houses, not the licensed guest houses, because for licensed guest houses, we have been complying with the Buildings Ordinance and Fire Services Ordinance. And so why are you taking this cross-the-board approach and affecting existing operations and affecting the economy as a whole? So much for my presentation. Thank you very much. Next one. The Association of Public Relations Practitioner, Mr. Leung Nga Lun. I speak on behalf of the Public Relations Practitioner. We strongly oppose that without consulting the trades that you are proceeding with the amendments of the regulations. Well, actually, 80% of the document has to do with how to introduce, say, district consultation and provisions in the DMCs and so on. We're trying to eradicate unlicensed guest houses, but only 20% of the content is on how to enhancing the licensing conditions. District councillor, you must act with conscience, and you should not just let it pass the way it is. You should make amendments. Well, you would be eradicating 80% of the stakeholders. Well, actually, there are some 1,600 licensed hotels and guest houses, and 300 of them are only hotels. And there is no regulation in the world that would eradicate 90% of the industry players. This is unjust and unfair. I think you should pay attention to this. Another thing is that in Hong Kong, well, some people say that it's all right if guest houses are eradicated because they take up only 10% of the accommodation rooms. But then the public practitioners rely very much on the guest house industry because a lot of the exhibitors coming to participate in exhibitions in Hong Kong would stay in these guest houses, and they would not be spending a lot on hotel accommodation. So if guest houses are not there, they would not come here to participate in exhibitions, and that would do a blow to the Hong Kong economy and the exhibition industry. Now, Hong Kong is trying to build Hong Kong into an exhibition and convention hub, and now you are having this amendment to stop people from coming, and people will turn to other places to stage exhibitions, participate in exhibitions. I think that goes against the government's objective as a whole. Now, another thing is that because there was this fire incident in this building, and there was this unlicensed guest house causing this fire, and hence the government is trying to eradicate all guest houses. But there have been reports that in hotels, people are trafficking, abusing drugs, and so on, even in hotels. So how come that you are targeting the guest houses and not the hotels? I don't think the policy should be lopsided. While Hong Kong is under one country, two systems, and we should not be implementing two different standards for the same industry, because the hotels and guest houses belong to the same industry, same sector. So theoretically, hotels should be more strictly regulated, in my view. So I think you are imposing more stringent restrictions on guest houses and not the hotels. So I don't see any provision or proposal in the consultation document on regulation of hotels. Next one is Civic Party, Mr. Chang Tak Hong. From Hong Kong Island District developer, Chang Tak Hong. Having heard all the deputations, I think the views are polarized. Some people think that we are trying to eradicate all guest houses, but the others are saying no to that. Our party's stance is that we shouldn't be eradicating all guest houses, but rather we should step up inspection on unlicensed guest houses and try to phase them out. We should try to regulate licensed houses to upgrade their standards. I think that would be a win-win scenario. Earlier on, the party had conducted a telephone survey. I would like to highlight a few salient points. For example, 40% of the respondents said that the regulatory regime on guest houses is too lenient. So the party believes that the licensing regime should be tightened, and that can take be in two specs. We should ask more stakeholders to participate in the license approval process, and we should also be stepping up inspections on the licensed houses and phase them out. And over 55% of the respondents said that under the present licensing regulatory regime, there is no public consultation. And actually, how guest houses operate will affect people in the neighborhood. So if residents' views are not taken into account, the community environment may deteriorate. And so the civic party believes that transparency should be enhanced and more consultation should be conducted so that residents can express their views on guest house licensing. Third, we asked them whether we should establish a statutory body to take charge of licensing of guest houses, and results show that 70% are in support of such a proposal, and the Civic Party believes that we can model after the Liquor Licensing Board, and there should be an independent statutory body to take charge of licensing work. Also, and for the present licensing standards, as long as the applicants have the planning permission and the land lease, appropriate land leases, then they can get a license. And Civic Party believes that in the in licensing, the provisions of the DMC should be taken into account. Now, lastly, under the present arrangement, only the applicants can make an appeal on the results, and the Civic Party believes that apart from them, the community bodies and residents should also have the right of appeal on the results of the licensing applications. Ms. Chu Kin-san from the Incorporated Owners of Continental Mansion. I'm from Continental Mansion. On this consultation document, residents in the mansion have a very strong response. We support the amendment. Over 100 submissions have been submitted to the OLA, and we hope that the proposals for amendment should be submitted to the electrical as soon as possible. On behalf of all the residents of Continental Mansion, I would like to express our worry and demand. In the interim period, before the amendments are effective, we ask that the OLA should seriously consider the renewal applications from licensed or guest houses. They should play a good gatekeeping role. They should not issue new license or renewing licenses leniently, and then they are, asking the owners corporations to take further action should they found them unsatisfactory. They should consider the DMC's provisions. It's just like a doctor. If he thinks that that particular medicine is not suitable to the patient, he should stop prescribing it and not say that he will wait for new medicine to arrive. I think there are so many problems. In late July, and there is a patron of the guest house in our mansion. He didn't pay any rent, and he stayed in the common areas, and he made all sorts of damages. He even was involved in an arson, and he was ultimately prosecuted. And we, the owners incorporation, planned to ask the relevant guest house to take responsibility. We don't want unhappy incidents to happen anymore. Mr. Long Tai-wai also made some remarks. Well, our owners corporation never said that the fire was caused by the guest house. Well, all the victims are tourists from the 3rd floor and 10th floor guest houses. And lastly, I thank all who are concerned about the Continental Mention, and we hope that the proposals can be endorsed as soon as possible. Thank you very much. Next one is from the DAB, Ms. Jacqueline Cheng. Thank you. I'm from the Central Committee member today. Again, I would like to say that guest houses cause nuisance to composite buildings. I think this is the right time to conduct a full review, especially in Taiwan and North Point. They are subject to these problems of the guest houses. We have conducted a telephone interview among 1,000 people, and we've collected submissions from 180 one-child residents. I think crackdown exercises should be stepped up. In our survey, we found that residents hope that the provisions of DMC should be taken into consideration in licensing. DMCs are very critical, and it is an important instrument for us to implement a good management for our buildings. In many buildings, there are no express provisions that the building should be used purely for residential purpose. But irrespectively, we know that a lot of DMCs do contain provisions saying that the unit should not be used for non-residential purposes. And in many old buildings, there is not such a provision in DMCs. And we recommend that residents should be consulted on the licensing matters, because the residents live there and they know well the nuisance to be caused or is caused. So I think the administration and the district and the electrical councillors should take heed of their views.
We also believe that the definition of guest house is not clear, because if you look at some of the guest houses, they would use different names, and they would let their units to companies as staff quarters and so on. So they just use different nomenclature to describe it, and therefore we hope that the administration can take the opportunity to review the definition of guest house as well. And then for hotels and guest houses, if you look at the respective definitions, there should be distinction between the two, and therefore there should be two different licenses to be issued to hotels and guest houses in order to rectify the problem right now. And we believe that for shadow guest houses, or in composite buildings, I think there are many right now. Like Continental mentioned, there are 7 or 8 right now, and in some cases there might be 7 or 8. There can be up to 7 or 8 such guest houses, and these are the unlicensed guest houses, and there would be problems regulating them. Next, incorporated owners of Burlington Building. Good morning. I'm chairman of the incorporated owners of Burlington Building, Wong Kwong Chiang. I think since the issue of occupation permit, and that has already defined the use of the building, and the OLA is the statutory body under the government. It has the statutory powers as regards how come guest houses are now allowed to be operated in residential building. I think these are the issues that the administration should be reviewing, because it's time for us to conduct a review. In fact, that has already violated the purpose of the occupation permit, and therefore there is a lot of room for discussion. So it's like holding a lock on the left hand, and then having a key in the right hand. And according to some officials, at present, you will have to comply with the building safety requirements of the BO, and you will also have to comply with fire safety regulations, and also you will have to apply to the OLA for a license. But then if you have to comply with the building safety requirements of the buildings department, according to some of my friends in the industry, they said that you can have different standards, and therefore there should not be a problem with regard to FSO. All right, so long as there is a fire escape. As to whether or not it's safe, how do you define it? Do you look at the width of the corridor and how many people can escape within a minute, and then will the FSD go there to check? and then after the guest house has been issued a license, when lodgers and residents are fighting for fire escape with residents of the building, then what happened? And according to the FS amendment bill enacted in 2007, well, for such guest houses operated in residential building, how can they be allowed? And therefore, I believe that to allow guest house to be run in composite buildings, and the administration is now working in accordance with the relevant law, I think that would be even more effective. For guest houses in residential buildings, I think they should be asked to move after being given a certain grace period. Next, the incorporated owners of Bright Star Mansion. My name is Li Xiaoxing, chairman of the incorporated owners of Bright Star Mansion. I'd like to say that the HAD has a team of people helping our OC to run the building, and according to their advice, we will have to replace the windows, and we will also have to review the DMC. I'm not sure about that because there is another team in the HAD from the OALA. They said that in issuing a license, they do not have to pay heed to the DMC of the building. But then when we manage the building, we would encounter certain situations whereby there might have been violation of the DMC. So I don't know whether or not the building management staff of the HAD will be able to help us. And second, I'd like to say that that's all I'd like to say for the time being. Next are the incorporated owners of Yan Mei Building, Ms. Wong Ching Ting. Thank you, Chairman. Well, for Yan Mei Building, if you look at the size of the unit, it's about 250 square feet. And in recent months, we noticed that 5 or 6 units have been let out to people of different nationalities. And every time when they come and stay, sometimes they would just stay for a couple of days, and the maximum would not be for more than 5 days. And the fact that they've been coming in and out of the building so frequently, even for caretakers, they don't have time to acquaint themselves with these lodgers, and there is no way that we can register the personal particulars of these lodgers. And we have also checked with the owners of these flats, and they said that they had let their units to a company, and the company has been using those units as staff quarters. And then for the management company, they think that well, so long as these people pay the rent and so on, that would have no impact on them whatsoever. But then that would have some impact on the building, because if there should be a fire breaking out, then the insurance company would not be compensating us, and therefore for the other occupiers, we will have to pay for these guest houses. We will have to pay higher premium, and we will also have to take up extra responsibility and liabilities for these people. And therefore, if they are indeed used as staff quarters for companies, then can the owners of these units show their business registration to us, and also the staff records, and also their pay slips and so on? Can they submit those to the OC instead of just telling us that they are staff quarters? In fact, they are unlicensed guest houses, and therefore they are saying that these are just staff quarters. And in fact, this is happening in many places and buildings in Wan Chai. We are also suggesting that under the FSO, you can do something about it, because of the frequent use of the unit by different people at different times. That would also cause problems. In fact, some units have also been installed with bunk beds, and there are many people coming in and out of those units, and that would also affect the normal use of the building by other occupiers, and they would also chat loudly, and they would also be using hand luggages and so on. And when the lifts or elevators arrive, they would also take up the lifts. And many residents are very concerned, because these people have different backgrounds, and they would just smoke outside the smoke doors, and also they would also be littering the place, and that would also cause hygiene problems. And residents' normal life would also be affected. Thank you. Next are the incorporated owners of Wing Tech Building, Wen Chai Road. Mr. Poon, good morning, everyone. Well, as far as our building is concerned, other than some of the unlicensed guest houses, there are another type of guest houses, and for a unit of just 300 square feet, you can have up to 30 people staying there, and most of these people come from the mainland, and they're involved in sales and marketing, and they don't want to stay in Hong Kong, but then unfortunately they have been forced to stay for a night or spend a night here. That's why they would come in and stay in such a cramped guest house. And I noticed that on one occasion there were three groups of 10 people staying in one unit. And when these people stay in that unit, their neighbors would often complain that they have actually littered the place, caused hygiene problems, and then for the litter bin there would be a lot of rubbish and garbage. And then the most disturbing thing is that there are so many people coming into the building, and for people from the mainland, often a time they would be smokers, and they would smoke even when they're in bed, and what happens to their cigarette butts. So many residents are concerned that that could cause problems, and our watchmen and caretakers have tried to go into the unit to carry out an inspection, but then they refused to open the door, and the caretaker was not able to do anything at all. And they also did some inspections outside the unit, and they confirmed that actually many of these are actually lodgers, and if you look at the fixture and furniture and decoration of the units, they look really like a guest house. And of course they do have problems, because for our caretakers and watchmen, they are not able to get a search warrant. I hope that you can lower the requirement, so that if you receive complaints from residents, and if you can have the witness statement or evidence from the caretakers that something untoward is going on in the unit, then some action can be taken. And what happens in a guest house next door? Well, I could testify that something untoward happened, but then in my building, if there are more than 20 people staying in one single unit, then I would be very concerned and worried. So if something untoward happens, then what am I supposed to do, and would I be able to escape with my family members? That's really my concern. Thank you. Next, the incorporated owners of Yan Wo Yut Building, Mr. Chen Kwok Chu. Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to speak. I'm representing Yan Wo Yut Building in airing our grievances today, because our building is very much like a Wing Tech Building for the licensed guest houses. I think they are taking advantage of the loopholes in the law, and if their guest houses are full, then there is a chance that they might be diverting some of their lodgers to another shadow guest house in the same building, and sometimes they would be coming in with the luggages and so on, and they would be cramming our lift. And sometimes when we try to register those people who have come in, and we can have up to 20-30 people coming in during the same night. And indeed, in our building we have the DMC, and then for Block A and Block B, they share the same entrance. And on one occasion, the fact that some of these units have been let to the shadow guest house operators, and most of these people are not really visitors to Hong Kong, and they are here to do a business, and they are involved in the pyramid marketing business. So why is it that people are claiming that if we try to regulate these guest houses, that would deal a blow to the hotel and guest house industry? In fact, that should not have been the case if they are running a legitimate business. I think these people are trying to use the units as shadow guest houses, and offer accommodation to these people. And in fact, we have been talking amongst ourselves about this problem. And when these lodgers come into the building, well, sometimes they would misbehave and misconduct themselves. They would be pressing the doorbell of another unit in the middle of the night, causing a lot of disturbance to the residents. And we have put in all the fire safety devices in our building, and yet when these mainlanders come, we know that some of these people are smokers, irrespective of the rules and regulations, and they would just dispose of their cigarette ends in the rear stairs. And what happens if there is a fire? So the liability will be put squarely on the shoulders of the OC, and also we also have to take out third-party liability insurance under Cap 344. So does that mean that the OC will have to be held responsible for the fire that they have caused? And what happens if something untoward happens? They should be held liable for that. So we don't know what we should be doing. Will we have to pay a higher premium for that?
Next one, Ms. Yolanda Ng, Wan Chai District Council Member. Thank you, Chairman. And what we're discussing today is not just targeting the only licensed guest houses, but unlicensed guest houses, shadow guest houses, subdivided units, and so on. And there are subdivided units costing $7,000 to $8,000 a month in my district, and also many unlicensed guest houses. So there are many problems brought about by these unlicensed guest houses, like fire safety, structural safety, and so on, that have been covered by many others. Lockhart Road 157, 517 Lockhart Road, there is a building with cracks, and a lot of residents from Causeway Bay have written in to me, and they said that their property rights have been infringed upon, and they have nowhere to turn to for help. And they dare not come here today because they're afraid of people revenging on them. So I support tightening up the licensing conditions, and we should model after the regime in the Liquor Licensing Board, and we should also consult the residents in the licensing regime. In the past, we said that many guest houses have gone against the provisions of DMCs, and I think we should also have empower more the law enforcement officers to do their work. And even if residents have videotaped the scenes, the unlicensed guest houses, and supply all sorts of evidence, and then they're not good enough. I think if we can introduce circumstantial evidence and signboards, and also online advertising of unlicensed guest houses, that would help crack down on unlicensed guest houses. I think we should also enhance the penalty. If someone is convicted and he is fined, imposed a fine only, then that is not deterrent enough. I hope that sentencing can be enhanced, and even they should be imprisoned. Residents are facing all sorts of problems, not just law and order and structural safety. We are talking about a question of justice, and I have been threatened because I'm helping the residents deal with unlicensed guest house problems. I was blackmailed because of doing that. I hope that the administration should face up to the problem. Next one, Mr. Chan King-chung, President of Hong Kong Hostels Alliance. I represent the Hostels Alliance. I haven't heard what you said. I tend to agree with what the Civic Party said. It seems that the views are quite polarized. First of all, for implementing any legislation, we should look at the feasibility and the fairness. When there was first licensing of guest houses, the government was acting like a third-party neutral, with a neutral position. So the guest houses have invested a lot of money into building their business, and I think it's all right for the government to enhance licensing regime. But then I think the government should be fair to the licensed guest houses. I'm a father, and whatever I do, I should be accountable, answerable to my daughter. Now, the government originally started out with a neutral stance. Now, at this juncture, it tends to change its stance, and that means the efforts and the money that we put in our business will all go down the drain. As to the feasibility of the recommendations, I would suggest that on top of the existing licensing regime, a point deduction scheme should be introduced. And in fact, some owners' corporations are not very clear about the licensing standards. If the government can enhance its transparency in licensing, that is to say, if anyone wishes to set up a guest house in a building, then they should ask a professional to come up with figures on, say, the electricity load, the pedestrian flow capacity, and so on. If the standards are met, then a license can be granted. Now, I am just talking about the new applicants, and existing licensees should not be affected. Well, the existing licensees have already complied with all the regulations and have made a lot of investments. Let me cite an example. Way back, P vehicle of private cars, well, the drivers of P vehicle, then they could also drive the light goods vehicles. But then there were so many accidents, and the government has changed its stance. So there has been a transitional period, i.e., before a certain date, you could still drive light goods vehicle with your P license, but then after a certain date, that is not allowed. When that was done, everyone was agreeable to the proposal. So there should be a grandfathering arrangement. I think whatever you do, you should do it fairly. Next one. Mr. Sam Lau from the Tourist Guest Houses Federation of Hong Kong Limited. Diaoyu Island is part of China's territory. I think the government should take heed of history. Well, you should be looking at that. In the past, you granted us licenses because we did everything you requested. And the OLA took into consideration all sorts of factors like safety and so on. Our federation was established in 1898. We have been consulting our trades and reflecting our views to the government. We have been on a constant dialogue with the government, and we are very well aware of the government's licensing regime. Now, in 1989, the government granted a license, and because of the impact of the unlicensed houses, we are suffering a loss. Now, there are so many shadow guest houses providing accommodation to individual traveler from the scheme. I think I have 2 points that the government should strengthen the inspection and clamp down on unlicensed guest houses. And second, for licensed guest houses, you can ask them to report on shadow guest houses and unlicensed guest houses. I think that can solve the problem. And doing that, well, we will be seeing an alleviation of the problem of people crowding in buildings and so on. Well, then we make the owners, corporations happy, and also the hotels will be happy because people will move into hotels and they will get a safe environment to stay. So these are the opinions of our federation. I won't go into all sorts of details. I've put everything down in my submission, written submission. And our guest houses are an industry just like normal any other industry in Hong Kong. We are operating legal business, and we are more than happy to report on illegal or unlicensed cases. Well, please write into the guest house operators to ask us to report on irregularities. I think the government should make enhancements to its systems, but then it should recognize what was done in the past. I think the problem can be resolved ultimately. Deputations, well, you have finished speaking. Perhaps I would first ask the administration to make a consolidated response to comments raised by deputations. Mr. Kwok, Assistant Director, please. Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, members and deputations. The review this time, actually, the consultation ended on the 28th of last month, and I'm very happy to be here today to exchange views with members and members of the public. And I thank deputations. And actually, you have written in your views within the consultation period, and we would listen to your views carefully. And we have heard concerns raised by the guest house sector, and we will consider them. I would have several points in responding. Now, our priority is safety. Guest houses, are they safe for the lodgers and the residents in the building? So the guest houses must comply with the FSO and BO before they can be granted a license. DMC has not been one of the factors in our licensing, but then we see that members of the public are very concerned about this. Another point of concern is that unlicensed guest houses pose a hazard to residents and lodgers. And actually, before the fire at Continental Mansion, we already started the review, and the review was not triggered by the fire. And our aim is not to threaten the survival of guest houses. Rather, we hope that after the revisions, amendments, we can crack down on licensed guest houses more effectively, and we will try to strike a balance. Several deputations have raised some comments. I would like to respond to them. First of all, guest house operators said that licensing takes a long time. Well, we have three phases in our licensing. The first, the applicant submits an application, and within 26 days, we will actually send someone to conduct an on-site inspection and issue a notice on how to improve the environment. And the second phase, the applicant they will carry on with the improvement works, and after that, in the third phase, we would inspect again, and we will issue a license in 28 days if all conditions are met. So 54 days altogether. Now, how comes that some applications take a longer time? And I think it has mainly to do with the second phase. Perhaps the applicant takes a long time to do enhancement works before the guest house reaches the relevant standards. So that explains for the longer period of time. Now, DMC. Well, at present, we don't consider DMC provisions, but for all applications and in all our directives, we tell the applicants and the licensees clearly that they must meet with the DMC provisions, and if they don't do so, they may have to bear certain liability. Well, over the years, we have reminded the applicants and also the existing licensees of that point. Now, in reality, some guest houses are operating in buildings where the DMCs do not allow for such establishments. So one of the emphasis on the consultation paper is to respond to concerns of the public on that area. We are not there to help implement the DMCs on behalf of the OCs. What we are trying to do is to is to ask whether a DMC should be taken as a factor for considering licensing. Some owners' corporations just now raised that some units have been used for shadow guest houses or staff quarters. Well, if we are aware of that, we would certainly conduct investigations. Now, if they fall under the definition of guest houses in our ordinance, we would definitely take enforcement action. As for searches within premises, and one of the recommendations in the consultation document is that our enforcement law officers can apply for a warrant from the court and then collect evidence within the guest houses. And we also like to introduce deeming provisions, making it easier for us to take our prosecution so that we can clamp down on unlicensed guest houses more effectively, and we want to minimize nuisance cost. And we also want to enhance licensing regime to cut down on nuisance caused to building residents. And we hope that the residents and the guest houses can exist harmoniously. So this is my response. Questions now for members of the panel. How many members would like to ask questions? Yusi Wing, Christopher Chung, Chairman, Peter Zhang, Tony Che, Frankie Yik, Kwok Wai Kang, and also our poor chair.
So I think we can afford to allow each member to have 5 minutes for both questions and answers. You can put the questions to the administration or to the deputations here, as Mr. Yu is not here. So over to you, Mr. Christopher Chung. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to put it to the trade and the administration, because just now some from the guest house industry say that they should be allowed to run guest houses in composite buildings and commercial buildings, because for new residential buildings, the DMC might not allow them to run guest house business in residential buildings. So what about commercial or composite buildings? If guest houses are only allowed to be run in such buildings, then in terms of enhancement and improvement of the business and the industry, do you think that would help? So can some of you just comment on this? And if you think that is not feasible, then there is no point raising this with the administration at all, right? All right, for commercial and composite buildings, if they are not allowed, then where are we supposed to run our business? Well, please listen to my question carefully. If you're not able to answer the question, you can defer to someone else to answer the question. I was asking if you would be prepared to run guest houses in composite or commercial buildings. Yes, Mr. Leung. All right, Mr. Chung. Well, I'm from the PR trade, and I've also invested in the guest house industry. And just now your question was whether or not consideration can be given to allowing guest houses to be run in composite or commercial buildings. I think that would not be very feasible, because if you look at guest houses, well, they have spent a lot in buying units. Some of them might actually have taken out mortgage loans in order to buy those residential units. I'm talking about the future. So for new guest houses, if they apply for a license in the future, and if they are only allowed to go to composite buildings, that's okay. Because if you allow them to be run at ground floor shop premises, and if they can run at premises previously used as nightclubs, then that would even be cleaner and more hygienic. Because we're talking about new licenses, because when they apply for a license, I think it's good for them to be segregated or separated from the residential part of the building. But then in the past, only when they are run in residential buildings will they be granted a license. That's a problem. But then as time has changed, circumstances have changed, and if the industry does not oppose to that, then if they are allowed to be run in commercial or composite buildings, I think that would cause fewer conflicts with the residents of the building. And if you do not object to that, then I'll have to ask the administration, is it possible for the commercial premises or commercial buildings or composite buildings to be granted a license to run guest houses? Is that possible? Mr. Kwok, thank you, Mr. Chung, for your question. Under the existing buildings ordinance, well, for the residential parts or domestic parts of the building, they can be used to run guest house business. That's the basis for the existing licensing mechanism. I'm asking about the future. The reason why some of these guest houses are located in residential buildings, that's the reason. And as far as we understand it, under the BO for commercial and composite building and also residential building, the design would be somewhat different and the specifications would also be different. So for Mr. Chung's views, I'll be conveying them to the headquarters to see if that's feasible and whether or not that will pose any problem on the building safety of commercial or composite buildings. You will have to do it anyway, because for the new DMC, most of them would not allow guest houses to be run in the residential building, and if you do not do anything about it, then that would impose a lot of restrictions on the guest house industry. And if you do not do something about it, if you do not relax the rules for commercial or composite building, what are they supposed to do? And if they are allowed to be run in commercial and composite buildings, then that would not cause any conflict with the residential or domestic parts of the building. That would be better. Yes, Yu Shi-wing, 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chairman. As we are all aware, in recent years, developments have been very rapid. Well, we are talking about some 70,000 rooms for the hotel industry, and then guest houses would offer some 80,000 rooms, and according to the occupancy rate, it's about 80 to 90% in recent years. And then with the revised or amended hotel and guest houses accommodation ordinance, I suspect that many residential buildings would say no to guest houses, and as a result of that, there would be a wave of closures of these guest houses, and you're talking about some 80,000 rooms offered by these guest houses. Over half of them might have to close down, but then Hong Kong's tourism ministry will have to continue to develop, and visitors will continue to come. So have you considered the issue of continuity? That's point number one. And number two, if there is a wave of closure of these licensed guest houses, then unlicensed guest houses will emerge. So the administration is already having a headache as to how you can clamp down on these unlicensed guest houses. And if a large number of licensed guest houses have to close down, then they would be turned into unlicensed guest houses. Will the administration be able to tackle the problem of unlicensed guest houses? And if you're not, then would you be adopting a band-aid approach when it comes to unlicensed guest houses? And just now, according to the industry, they said that between hotels and guest houses, they're actually applying the same ordinance to them when it comes to building safety and fire safety installations. But then if you look at the number of occupants and lodgers, hotels are very different from guest houses, and yet the administration is using the same ordinance to regulate them. That's already outdated, and therefore in reviewing and amending this legislation, you should consider separating the two so that there would be two sets of rules and regulations regulating them, so that when they apply for a hotel license, they should rely on a dedicated piece of legislation on hotels, and then guest houses would be regulated by another piece of legislation. Sometimes guest houses would use the name of hotels, and yet they are just guest houses, not hotels. So how are you going to deal with them? So 3 questions altogether. Mr. Kwok, thank you. First, on hotel rooms and guest house or guest rooms and the supply. Well, as far as we are aware, for guest houses, if you look at the rooms offered by guest houses, they are taking up about 10% of the total number of rooms available. So we're talking about some 9,000 rooms, and according to the information that I have, if you look at the number of new hotels in the next few years, we're talking about over 14,000 in the next few years, and therefore there is a steady supply of rooms coming on stream. And of course, the Tourism Commission will be watching closely as to the supply and demand situation for hotel rooms and guest rooms. So with regard to our clampdown on unlicensed guest houses, one of the important parts of our consultation document is to enhance our capability or ability to clamp down on unlicensed guest houses. We are also proposing to increase the penalty in order to achieve a greater deterrent effect. We will spare no effort in clamping down on them, and we hope that with the revision in law, we will be even more effective and able to clamp down on unlicensed guest houses. As regards the definition of hotels and guest houses under the present legislation for guest house, if you offer short stay sleeping accommodation, then you would be meeting the requirement. But I understand that there is a difference between hotels and guest houses when it comes to the operation, and therefore we'll be looking at the two premises and two different licenses will be issued. Even though the nature of operation is very similar, but then for the different premises we'll be issuing different licenses. The main reason is that whether they are hotels or guest houses, we are mainly concerned about the safety of these premises. Of course, they will have to comply with the current rules and regulations, and they will have to continue to comply with those rules and regulations. But then we'll propose to separate the two, and in the course of our consultation, we have also heard comments saying that some guest houses might be misleading their guests by using the name of hotels and so on. So we'll see how we can respond to that concern. Chairman, I think that the first issue is about the assessment on the occupancy rate and also the growth in tourist arrivals. I think the administration's reply is too simplistic. You will have to really assess that with the amendment bill, how many people will be affected, and as a result, will there be a shortfall in the number of rooms available, and how are you going to deal with them? And if you just say that the impact would be small, then that's not very good. Mr. Kenneth Chan, I think we have different departments responsible for different policies, and therefore, you can have one department responsible for that, and then for tourist arrivals, it has nothing to do with the HAD, and that's under the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau under Guesthouse, and they haven't yet submitted their report, and they would just say that they are subject to a lot of pressure. So when you talk to another department, if you want somebody to be held accountable, you should have approached Guesthouse as to how many guest houses will have to close down, whether or not visitors will not be able to find accommodation here in Hong Kong, or even if you vent all your anger on them, they will not be able to answer your question because they are not the Policy Bureau responsible for that. So I think would there be unscrupulous operators? Well, all of them here, you might have engaged in a legitimate business. That's why you might not know what is happening. But then for people who try to change their mode of operation, all right, some guest houses, actually, you're talking about short stay accommodation, so under 28 days. And if you want to tighten up the regulations so that you will have to come up with a different licensing authority. So if they change their mode of operation so that they can only be let out on a monthly basis, so what if they let it to a travel agency, and then the travel agency will just take on customers, and then they would charge them on a daily basis. So would they be letting those premises as staff quarters and so on? So you don't know. So some deputations said that they are very concerned about this. So my question for you is, all right, if we work together with you to ensure that there will be changes, all right, everybody will be happy about this. But then there are bound to be unscrupulous operators, and if they try to circumvent the rule by letting those premises out on a monthly basis, so what if we are able to furnish or reduce circumstantial evidence? So if that is done, then are you confident that you'll still be able to clamp down on these unscrupulous operators? Chairman, yes, indeed, under the Hotel and Guest House Accommodation Ordinance, we can only clamp down on unlicensed guest houses, and for those running legitimate business, that they are not our targets. And as we have set out in a paper, if somebody claims that the unit has been rented to someone else on a monthly basis, but then in fact they are running de facto guest houses, then we will still be targeting them. So if we're able to prosecute them on the basis of circumstantial evidence, that would also facilitate our enforcement action. Because at present, if you want to prosecute and convict an unlicensed guest house, one of the important pieces of evidence will be the collection of a fee at the front desk. That's why we are trying to introduce this element of circumstantial evidence in order to convict those people. And of course, it would depend on the merits of the case. And in many cases, with circumstantial evidence, if we can adduce sufficient evidence to convict those people, even if they claim that the unit has been used as a staff quarter, then if we are able to prove that they have collected a fee, then we will be able to convict. Well, on what basis can you convict? Well, it depends. If the unit has been let out on a short-term basis, and if they charge a fee, then that will already be regulated by ordinance. And our purpose is to collect sufficient evidence so that we can take out prosecution action. And if we are able to introduce this element of circumstantial evidence, that would greatly facilitate our enforcement action. But then I'd just like to say that with regard to the amendment of the bill, the Civic Party has been saying many times and reflected that to the administration, we support the stepping up of the enforcement action. But then for the scoring point or the merit point system, we would also welcome that, because in a community, if we're able to come up with an acceptable and safe mechanism which can ensure the safety of the residents, of course, we will support that. But then very often, for these unscrupulous operators and also shadow guest houses, they would resort to all sorts of tactics to intimidate the residents and so on. And of course, we should be putting that as our top priority. But then what I'm telling you is that other than tightening up the licensing procedures, there are also unscrupulous operators who are already doing this bad thing by circumventing the law. So I haven't heard very specifically as to how you are able to address these concerns in a community so that they can work together with you to target these, so that instead of letting the accommodation on a daily basis, they would also be letting that out on a monthly basis. So how are you able to collect sufficient evidence to prosecute them?
Next one, Mr. Peter Chung. Thank you, Chairman. For amendment of a piece of ordinance, the aim very often is to crack down on the bad elements. But in effect, if you are targeting the good people, then that's not going to work. Now, some people from the trade just said that if they are going to renew the license, they will meet with a lot of opposition from residents in the building. And some people may have already purchased a unit and they want to start up a guest house. They may have to tackle the issue of how the industry is faring. And I think the government should strike a balance between the residents, the interests of the residents and the guest houses. Now, if the guest house is up and running already and it's causing great nuisance, then it's perfectly acceptable that you don't renew the license. So my question is, how do you strike this balance? Second, on law enforcement, the Vice Chairman also said that once amendment is in place, there are bound to be loopholes that people can take advantage of. One of them is a monthly apartment rented out on a monthly basis. Say, I rent it out to you on a monthly basis for, say, $1,000, and then you are we're staying just for 2 days, and that can be done as well. Now, as regards staff quarters, it seems that from circumstantial evidence, it doesn't seem to be staff quarters. But then they give you all the evidence that they are really indeed the staff on the mainland. So how are you going to deal with that? You said that in your amendment proposal, you try to build in a warrant mechanism. But then, very often, I'm afraid, you may not be able to take out prosecution, even with the amendments in place. So, on the question of enforcement, now, if they already have a license, they're causing great nuisance, generating a lot of complaints, how would you consider those cases when you are processing a license renewal application? And also the question on staff quarters. How are you going to deal with that problem? Thank you, Mr. Peter John, for your question on how to listen to residents' views. That is precisely one of the emphasis in the consultation document. In the paper, we proposed that whether it's a new license application or license renewal, we can take heed of residents' views before making a decision. On that, we propose 3 options on how to gauge public views. Option one is to conduct consultation through a district officer, and then second is to establish an independent panel to gauge public views, and third is to establish a brand new statutory body to listen to views. These are the options responding to Mr. Zhang's concerns. Even if if a guest house is up and running, it may still cause nuisance. So we would also be listening to residents' views. It's not the case that we would automatically not renew a license if there is any opposition. What we will do is that we will listen to residents' views, and we will also give a chance for the applicant to respond to the concerns raised and see whether solutions can be found. And we hope to go through that before we make a decision. We have proposed 3 options, and after consolidating the views collected, we will make a decision. Second, the ordinance targets at those say shadow guest houses, which are really the premises which are serving as guest houses but claim they're not. So with the amendments in place, we would be able to collect evidence more easily. So if we do our amendments, we would try to see if there are further ways that we can collect evidence more easily. Mr. Tony Chia. On the operation of guest houses, actually in the past many people have given a lot of views. And this goes to show that the present condition is not satisfactory. And many deputations have given us different views, and there are many deficiencies in the present system. In enhancing the penalty to crack down on unlicensed guest houses or shadow guest houses, I think this is something that most people will support. Now, the Vice Chair said that different government departments have different work portfolios, but then if we're now talking about a review of the ordinance, we would have to study the role played by guest houses in Hong Kong's tourism and the economy as a whole. The government should make an assessment on the value of guest houses, and well, for any ordinance, it's not that we want to clamp down on all guest houses. It's just that we would like to eradicate the unlicensed ones. I think we should help instead the licensed guest houses, because they are playing a good role in the industry. So the consultation document is not comprehensive enough. I think we should take an overall view on the entire industry. I think many government departments have to be involved. I think the HAD should play a leading role, because they are the government department issuing the licenses. So can the administration respond? For the existing 8,000 to 9,000 guest house rooms, are these too many? Is the number too high? Or are the guest houses not playing a good function here? Now, guest houses are not hotels. They provide short-stay accommodation, and they're different from hotels in many aspects. For example, guest houses may exist in residential buildings, but for hotels are not domestic buildings. So this is a marked difference between the two. I think for whatever form they take, safety should be of utmost concern. So, in considering safety issues, should the government designate certain types of buildings which are considered suitable for housing guest houses? Well, many people think that if guest houses are located in non-residential building, less nuisance may be created and it's more acceptable. Can that be done? And if there are amendments to the ordinance, well, there are already existing licensed guest houses. They have already made heavy commitment, investment into the establishments. Should we take a sweeping approach and then they are eradicated and they are, they will be suffering big losses? So can this be considered? So please do not make unnecessary noise, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your questions. I have already responded to some of the points. Under our ordinance, safety is of utmost concern. The spirit of the ordinance is that we should ask guest houses to comply with buildings ordinance and fire services ordinances. We are responding to another demand of the public, is that whether nuisance will be created when guest houses are located in composite buildings. We understand that the amendments will affect existing operators, especially if we are considering the explicit restrictive provisions in the DMCs, and we estimate that at some 200 guest houses will be affected as a result of that. We have also heard views about a grace period or transitional arrangement. And what we're going to do is that we would collate all the opinions collected, and then we will make some decisions. We won't rule out any kind of possibility. Can you, what's your stance or basic policy towards the existence of guest houses? We are concerned about safety issues. Guest houses do play a certain role in contributing to the tourism industry. So we will be keeping a close dialogue with the Tourism Commission, and we would hope that the tourism industry won't be affected too much as a result of the proposed amendments. Mr. Frankie Yick, the administration just now said that within the consultation, they try to tackle problems of nuisance caused to residents. Of course, we understand, and some members already said that if we go by your proposals, a lot of the guest houses will be forced to close down. But it seems strange that you have consulted other government departments, and they said that the impact will not be that great. I beg to differ. Well, can the administration try to treat things differently? Now, let's talk about the licensed and unlicensed guest houses. For cracking down on unlicensed guest houses, you face a lot of difficulties. Mr. Peter Zhang raised the issue about staff quarters. A property owner may rent it out as a staff quarters for a company, and they subdivided it and then rent it out to other people. There's nothing much you can do. Well, the same happens in the airport. So even with the police's decoy operations, I mean, the problem can't be eradicated. So can the government first proceed with cracking down on unlicensed guest house first? Secondly, well, would the same nuisance be created by those licensed operators and unlicensed operators? The answer I get is no, because the licensed operators will not be causing much, was not as great nuisance as the unlicensed operators, because their license may be taken away if they do so. So the 8 weeks consultation, well, the consultation period is not long enough, and the associations, the trade associations, strongly oppose the recommendations, but do you have some counter suggestions on how to tackle the problems raised? So please just don't tell us that I object and object. Well, please go back and give us some counter proposals. Now, Miss Cheng, you said that you are an ordinary member of the public, but you said that you support guest houses and buildings because they will help improve the law and order and hygiene conditions in a certain building. If this is really the case, then that can serve as a role model, and we can, based on that experience, raise some constructive comments and suggestions for the government to consider. Do you want the administration to respond? Yes. Would you consider first amending the part of the legislation on empowering you to strengthen your enforcement power, law enforcement power? Yes. Well, with further views, we will consider that. Next one, Mr. Kok Wai Kang. Thank you, Chairman. In this day and age, the ordinance is quite problematic because some guest houses are operating contrary to DMC provisions. I would like to ask the HAD this. In the past, you adopted a more lenient approach towards guest houses, and today you are just targeting the licensed guest houses, and you don't have comprehensive policy, and you are not recognizing the contribution of the guest houses in the past. So I think the HAD should develop a reasonable licensing regime for guest houses. If the proposed amendments are implemented, I'm sure that 10 out of 10 buildings would not welcome guest houses. Does it mean that all the guest houses will be forced out of business? Will there be industrial buildings which can accommodate guest houses, or composite buildings, or even commercial buildings to house these guest houses? I think this is something that you should consider. I think we should also look at the issue from a legal point of view. The DMC in a building is a set of rules which everybody should abide by in the building.
The fact that we have this messy situation right now, that's because the administration has not been doing its job in the past. All right, they are saying that even if I issue you with a license, it doesn't mean that everything you do is okay. But then most guest houses would be telling the OCs of the building that they've already got a license, so you can do nothing about it. You can't do anything about me. So today, even if you try to rectify the situation, some remedial measures will have to be taken. Well, according to the deputations for the unlicensed guest houses, I think there is no objection whatsoever. You will have to enforce the law stringently. You will have to eradicate them. Whatever you have to do, whether or not it's by way of enhancing your power to apply for a search warrant to enter the premises, or increasing a penalty, and to withhold a license for at least 6 months and so on. Everybody is in favor of that. Well, for unlicensed guest houses, by all means, you should clamp down on them. But then for the new licensing regime, well, for new applicants, it's okay to tighten up the regime, because they will be making an informed decision when they apply for a license. But then for existing guest houses, well, most residential blocks would not welcome them. And under the DMC, if you operate a guest house in a residential building, you will still be paying one portion of the management fee like any other units in a building. But then when there is a guest house in a residential building, there will be more problems to be dealt with by the OCs concerned. That's why they do not welcome such operations. So should they be paying more when compared to their neighbors in order to make up for the problems that they bring into the building? I think that is a direction that we can consider, because you will have to balance the interest. Well, even if you set aside other issues, well, they would actually incur more spending by the building. That's why they should be paying more. So can the HAD take the initiative to come up with some suggestions so that for guest houses in a residential building, if they have not broken any provisions in the DMC, then is there any room for them to reach an agreement with the OC concerned? Or else, if you have to force them out of residential buildings, and if they turn into unauthorized or unlicensed operations, then the problems might be even more serious. In the past, you have been taking action against unlicensed guest houses, but then you have not worked hard enough. That's why unlicensed guest houses seem to have taken up the lion's share in the market. But then if you do not step up inspection and enforcement, the problem will just continue and proliferate. So how many more manpower will be added to the department in taking out enforcement action? I don't think you have enough time for that. So we will have to wait for another round. Next, Paul Chair. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to ask questions even though I'm not a member of the panel. I'd like to declare this because I was also victimized because I was in one of the residential buildings, but then one of the other occupants tried to convert a unit into a guest house, even though they claim that it's used by a university. That's why I can fully sympathize with those of you who have been troubled by this problem. Well, even if there is a DMC, but then if you have to institute private action against the operator, then there will be a lot of problems in terms of procedural and otherwise. All right. Initially, you introduced this existing mechanism for expediency, but now, as time has changed, you have encountered problems. And in para 2.3, you said that back in 1991, when you considered this piece of legislation, you did not really consider the obstacles posed by the DMC, and you have deliberately ignored that, and as a result, you have introduced this problem, and you said that in enforcement you have encountered difficulties. And then Mr. Kwok Wai Keung was right in saying that in taking out enforcement action in para 2.15, you said that if the administration had really been persistent in its action, then even if when you look at the prosecution figures, it's 4 times the earlier figures. So long as you have the will, there is a way to do it. But then I still think that you haven't done enough. Probably that's because under the law you do not have enough powers, and also in terms of adducing evidence you have difficulties. But then if you had intended to do more, you would have been able to do a lot more. For example, well, you spent a lot of paragraphs talking about the 3 options in consulting the public. You'll be consulting the buildings concerned as well. But then starting from April this year, you just said that you would adopt this mechanism. You would be writing to the stakeholders of buildings so that they can raise objection towards this application. But then in the past, you never informed the building concerned. You never informed the stakeholders. You never informed the OC or the people who are likely to be affected. If you had done that, then under the existing mechanism, if you can do that, then many people would have taken action against it. And according to the civic party, in fact, for the affected parties, the aggrieved persons would have been able to lodge an appeal. But that in the past, as you have not done that at all, because they have not been informed, that's why they have not been able to take action against it. So before you can amend the legislation, you will have to step up your prosecution action, you will have to step up enforcement, you will have to inform the stakeholders before really considering amending the law. by giving you more powers to tackle the problem. For example, you have 19 and 20. There are mechanisms in place so that if the licensee has failed to comply with the licensing conditions, or if they break any rules in terms of safety and so on, you can also apply for a closure order to the court so that they can be forced to close down, including the shadow guest houses. If they have broken all the licensing conditions, you can just close them down. But then in how many cases have you been able to invoke section 19 and 20, and have you done that? Has that been successful? And if you have not done that, if you just adopt this across the board approach in targeting both licensed and unlicensed guest houses, that's really an outdated approach. So to remedy the situation, number one, you will have to step up action against the unlicensed guest houses, and if they can be used as pilot points, then if it's successful, then you simply do not have to do anything else, because for people who are running a legitimate business, they have invested heavily in running these guest houses. They should not be eradicated, because if you look at the tourism sector in Hong Kong, the reason why we have had this expediency measure, that's because of the rapid increase in the number of visitors, and many people do not want to stay in hotels. And even if you open more hotels, their demand cannot be satisfied. For the MICE visitors, they would like to stay in cheap accommodation, and in Hong Kong situation, that simply cannot be accommodated. That's why you will need to have this expediency measure by having guest houses, and therefore you will have to strike a balance between the development of the tourism industry and minimizing the disturbance caused to the residents of the building. And if you're able to clamp down on unlicensed guest houses, you would have reduced the problem significantly, instead of pitching the guest house lodgers and the residents. So I don't think you have time to answer the question. Sorry, I don't have time. I would also like to ask questions, but then some of them have been asked by my colleagues. I'd just like to say this. I've read the consultation paper, and my understanding is that, some 20 years ago, the tourism sector told you that they had this shortage of guest rooms. That's why the administration just adopted this half-hearted approach. So you allow the existence of these guest houses, and some 20 years down the road, time has changed and the circumstances have changed, and now you have this problem, and you try to adjust your policy in order to tackle the problem. But then my question is, other than the 9,000 rooms which are run by licensed guest houses, so do you know exactly how many unlicensed or shadow guest houses are there in a market, and how many rooms are they offering, and what kind of role are they playing in the tourism industry? The administration seems to be clamping down on them, but then I don't think you have worked hard enough. I don't want to second guess the motive behind this, but then I think the demand for such rooms is great. You cannot just ignore the demand. And if you say that I'll have to clamp down on these guest houses very strictly, but then what about the consequence? Who is going to shoulder the consequence? What happens if visitors are not able to find accommodation when they come here? So, of course, it's not your business, because that's the business of the Tourism Commission. But then, are you asking the visitors to stay in railway stations and so on? As a cosmopolitan city, we have to take care of visitors from different backgrounds. So, what are the measures that are in place to take care of them? And secondly, I'd also like you to respond to a question raised by Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Just now, you didn't have time. So, in the licensing process, does the administration have a more proactive role to play to coordinate between the different stakeholders? Just now, you said that in the consultation document, you put out 3 options, but then one point has been missing, and that is in assessing the future applications. What are the criteria to be taken on board? For example, when it comes to the DMC, as soon as the DMC bans such operation, you will not be issuing a license, because what about those de facto guest houses? You will have to deal with them. So can you do some coordinating work so that you can mediate between the operators and the OCs to reach an agreement, including those proposed by Mr. Kwok Wai Keung? So that's point number 2. And number 3 is a point raised by Mr. Paul Chair. You will have to respond to that. Thank you, Chairman. when we look at the overall demand for guest rooms, I think Tourism Commission has conducted some assessments, and in terms of the demand for guest rooms, I think some measures have been put in place. But then, as far as we are concerned, our main concern is whether or not these accommodation is safe. That's why our purpose of revising the ordinance is not to drive them out of business. In fact, as we have said, we believe that both can be done in tandem. So on the one hand, the trade can do their business and survive, and on the other, we would like to minimize the disturbance that might be caused to the residents. And of course, it's a balancing act, and that's why we are here to listen to your views. And of course, there are circumstances, for example, under option 3, if a new statutory body is to be set up, then of course it's like the liquor licensing board. Is up to the board to decide on the criteria for licensing. And of course, it's not for us to say, but then in the next stage, we will have to analyze the feedback on these 3 options, and then we will have to assess the scenarios under the different options. For example, under option 2, if there is an independent panel and so on. So in considering the different factors, what factors should be taken on board. And as we said, if there is one objection from a resident, it doesn't mean that the application for renewal of license will be rejected right away. We hope that both sides can have a chance to communicate and talk to one another.
Mr. Kwok asked whether there are ways to promote communication between the 2 sides, but the overriding principle is that the OLA will listen to views from both sides before making a decision on licensing. As to the number of unlicensed guest houses, we have received a number of complaints in the past few years. In 2013 and 14, over 1,000 complaints have been received. Well, there are some repeated complaints, of course, and for some others, and we found that the premises don't fall within the definition of guest houses under the existing ordinance. We would follow up duly on every complaint. We've received over 1,000 complaints against unlicensed operators, unlicensed guest house operators. Next one, Mr. Wu Chi-wai. Thank you, Chairman. How does the administration assess the impact on guest houses pending the change or enhancement of your enforcement power? Actually, a lot of problems stem from unlicensed guest houses. And what we heard today is that we don't have enough power to enforce the law against unlicensed guest houses. Secondly, in our review, why don't you review the provision that guest houses should only exist in residential buildings? I think a lot of the problems have to do with this point. You've always said that safety is of utmost concern, and that guest houses should not be placed in buildings other than residential buildings. I think that this is the root of the problem. Why don't you review that, and why don't you consult the public on that? In fact, Carrie Lam, when she was with the Development Bureau, she talked about allowing industrial buildings to be converted into buildings for accommodating guest houses. How come that this point was not mentioned in the consultation paper? Why are you highlighting the nuisance, just the nuisance caused to residents in residential buildings? Guest houses are now housed in domestic buildings, and that triggers a lot of debates. But if you don't deal with this point, i.e., if they are not located within residential buildings, where they can they be located? And if they can't get a license, and they will be operating without a license, and that will even cause great nuisance to residents. So how will you tackle these 2 points? Thank you, Chairman. First, I would like to clarify. nuisance caused, well, not only by unlicensed guest houses, but also licensed guest houses. So I'm not ruling that out, Chairman, but my question is, well, if you have a license, at least you've got the license to regulate them. But unlicensed operators go totally unregulated. So my question is, how do you deal with the problem of licensed guest houses becoming unlicensed after the amendments are in place? Now, on enforcement, we have been stepping up our enforcement actions, and the number of enforcement actions taken has increased 3 times from 2011 to 2013. Why there is a low level of prosecution actions? Because of the restrictions in the ordinance. So in the consultation documents, we made recommendations to give us more power to tackle the problem of unlicensed guest houses. If we can do that, I think the nuisance caused to residents can be minimized. And of course, we have at the same time deal with nuisance caused by licensed guest houses. Now, as to the question of residential buildings, I have already responded to Mr. Christopher Chung's question. I would take that up with other government departments. We would have to consider all the factors, including the building requirements, size requirements, and so on. And I think that even with the amendments, there are still people who will operate unlicensed guest houses. We will still continue with our enforcement actions. And with the latest amendments, I think we can do a better job in enforcing the law. Chairman, can you elaborate on the problems you face in enforcing the law? How can you tackle these problems under your proposed amendments? Well, I'll try to respond as much as I can. In the consultation document, we have listed all the problems in our enforcement actions. If we are to successfully prosecute, we should have sufficient evidence to prove that the place is providing a short-term accommodation at a fee. Well, that poses certain difficulties. Well, travelers sometimes don't want to provide information, and even if they provide information, they don't want to appear in court in Hong Kong. So that's the first difficulty. Second difficulty, there are a lot of online transactions. So the cash transactions don't take place in Hong Kong. So it's difficult to prove that there are cash transactions in Hong Kong, money transactions here. So sometimes we spot that there are premises where a lot of travelers are going in and out, and there are a lot of utensils like toothbrushes and so on. So aren't they guest houses? So this time round in our proposals, we say that we would include an element of circumstantial evidence. So we would continue with our enforcement actions. We would keep up with our efforts. And with the latest amendments, we think we can overcome the difficulties we face now. And also, we have difficulties in prosecuting the keeper or the serviceman. But really, the mastermind, the real operator behind the guest house, we don't have enough evidence to prosecute him or her. So that's why we have proposed deeming provisions, i.e., we can actually take the real operator to court and crack down on unlicensed guest houses. So these are the proposals that we are trying to put in place to tackle the problem. Mr. Raymond Chan, deeming provisions and also circumstantial evidence mentioned by the Assistant Director. I don't think the Tray has any opposition to that. Members similarly don't have a strong objection at all. So that can be done, definitely. So don't you want to take a phased approach? First of all, we will empower you to take out prosecutions against unlicensed operators first. This is not contentious at all. Nobody will oppose that. We see that the number of prosecution enforcement actions in the first quarter, 3,000 in the first quarter, and only 40 cases have been convicted. So it goes to show that the ordinance is not good enough, has deficiencies or flaws. Now, if you consult the residents in a building, they will tell you that you should be first cracking down on the unlicensed operators and then ask the licensed operators to make improvements. So should we adopt a phased approach? And that would be fairer to the trade, I believe. I agree with the Assistant Director's remarks on safety coming first. Now, if it is not safe, even if the visitors are forced to sleep rough, then that's well, we shouldn't be providing any unsafe accommodation. In terms of supply, it's said that the hotels to be built can meet the demand, but you have to appreciate the positioning and the pricing of the guest houses are so very different from those of the hotels. So you try to give us these figures saying that the impact will be minimal, but the reality is not like what you said. Well, you try to convince us with the figures that the impact is going to be minimal, and then I don't think this is right. Well, the trades hope that the existing operators should not be regulated, but I don't think that's an acceptable approach. I think we should try to come up with the right level of tightening of the legislation which is acceptable to all. You said that some 80 or 90% of the operators will be phased out because of these proposals. So now, if, say, we go by a phased approach of implementing the proposed recommendations, what do you feel about it? Do you agree with this approach? Sorry? Many members have raised many comments. Our operator has been operating for some 30 years. I'm the second generation operator, and I'm well aware of the development of the industry. I agree that we should crack down first on the unlicensed guest houses. Well, should guest houses be allowed to exist in composite building and even commercial buildings? If that is allowed, I think the trade is more than willing to do that. And a lot of the operators are taking out loans to get their guest houses started. They will be firstly affected by the proposed amendments. Now, I think we should go down to tackling the unlicensed operators first. In sincere building alone, there are so many unlicensed operators already. I think the OLA is not doing a good job. I've asked a website operator, and they said that they can run a business. Well, what they're doing is they put these unlicensed guest houses advertisements on the web and then try to attract customers from the mainland, and that is going to do a blow to the licensed guest house operators. That's all I want to say. My last name is Zhang. I am from the guest house sectors also. I started working in the trade from 19, and I'm now in my 40s. I am a sort of professional in the field. The government has never consulted the trade in putting out this consultation document. I think the government's mindset was that of the Stone Age mindset. Well, I want to raise a point which has never been mentioned by anybody. We should try to tackle the problem at source. And I think enforcement is a crux. Everything now operates via the website. I have asked this Wailong website portal, and I asked them, how come that you don't have to look at the business license of the guest houses before you sell the rooms for this guest house? This is a mainland website. So can the government set up a team or a working group and to browse the website and try to clamp down on the online advertisements? For our trade, I think we adopt an open attitude. I've asked many people in my trade, say for Continental Mention, the Owners Corporation chairman, they do have their own worries. Can you be quicker? Well, what I want to say is that the owners' corporations can have a legal recourse when it comes to the DMCs. So if you talk about DMCs, say the mahjong parlors and games centers, many of them are located in the upstairs floors of a residential building. So I think we should be treated equally, and so much for the questioning time today, and I would like to thank the deputations and individuals for coming, and you can now leave. Thank you. Next, I would like to remind the government that this public hearing was held after the end of the consultation period. The consultation period lasted 2 months, but then that was exactly fell within the summer recess of the electrical. So that's why we are holding the public hearing today. I hope that the government should incorporate the comments expressed today, although these views were expressed after the end of the consultation period. So when the report of the consultation is promulgated, please notify this panel as soon as possible so that we can follow up duly. So AOB now. Before ending the discussion of this item, Chairman, can the administration provide us with the figures? Section 19 and Section 20 of the Ordinance. Have you invoked those sections to close down unlicensed guest houses? Can you provide us with the number of guest houses so closed down? So, yes, let's do that after. Let's ask them to do that after the meeting. AOB? No? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.